As is the festival tradition, our final speaker is our president, Wes Jackson. He needs no introduction, of course. But let me remind you that he's been our leader at the Land Institute and founder 39 years ago. As I mentioned at the start of the festival, he plans to step down as president next June when he celebrates his 80th birthday. And next year, at next year's festival, by the way, we will be celebrating the 40th anniversary of the Land Institute. It'll be a special festival, as you might expect. Although Wes is stepping down as our leader, the mission he defined to revolutionize agriculture and bring it into harmony with nature will continue. That's a goal that's crucial to humanity. He has pursued it with passion, and a consequence of that is the creation of a movement, and many of you count yourselves as part of that today. Thank you. Wes has created an organization with strength. He has given us an enduring legacy. The work he began will continue. Please welcome Wes Jackson.
I guess that means hello. Well, thank you all for coming. I think it's been a great couple of days, and it's folks like you that make it so. Psalm 19, verse 12. So teach us to number our days, that we may apply our hearts unto wisdom. Hans Jenny, the foremost American scientist of the 20th century, UC Berkeley, other places, was an immigrant. He came from Europe. And I want to read what he said. When the early immigrants settled in Pennsylvania, they were astounded by the high fertility of the valley and limestone soils. Crops are bountiful and livestock is thriving, wrote the Mennonites to their brethren in the old country, where good land was scarce, and in some places, a vacating tenant farmer could take topsoil to a new location. In the New World, instead, manuring and liming did not pay. Soon the rules of European soil husbandry were forgotten, except in tradition-motivated communities such as those of the Amish. Many pioneers acquired more land than they could handle, and soil washing, that is erosion, became rampant. People shrugged it off. When the soil gives out, more is available out west. And when the stream of immigrants reached Ohio and the Middle West and cultivated the rich silt loams, the local surplus of food became staggering. To move it to markets, fattened cattle and hogs were driven in across the mountains to Boston and Philadelphia, and corn and wheat were loaded onto Mississippi barges destined for New Orleans. transferred to sailed ships the cargoes headed for Europe. To cope with this flood of cheap grain, a small country like Switzerland, where Hans Jenny had come from, a small country like Switzerland had to shift from wheat farming to dairying and cheese making. Hans told me that as a boy, he would help carry the bottom furrow of a field to the top. And if it was too steep for the horses, humans carried it themselves. Our immigration policy has changed little in 150 years, partly because of our still fertile soils and huge fossil fuel-based inputs. We have even used our excess capacity to use food as an international weapon and to make fuel for transportation. According to the United Nations, we're losing 30 million acres a year worldwide due to land degradation. The United States FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, has declared this year, 2015, as the International Year of Soils. Global soils are in danger, the FAO says, because of expanding cities, deforestation, unsustainable land use and management practices, pollution, overgrazing, and climate change. The usual rate of soil degradation threatens the capacity to meet the demands of future generations, says FAO. And as long as soils are at risk, sustainable agriculture, food security, and the provision of ecosystem services are compromised. They state the obvious, of course. The current rate of soil degradation threatens the capacity to meet the needs of future generations. Promotion of sustainable soil and land management is central to ensuring a productive food system. You can read right down the list and we know it all. The big question, will the FAO's efforts be effective to save the global soils? Some good is sure to come, but how much? This is the United Nations, and the FAO is a big organization with regional offices in Africa, the Pacific, Central Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean, Near East, North Africa. We have our county offices here to help with a track record going back over 80 years. But will this global effort be enough to turn the tide of soil degradation? There have been other sources of awareness in the past. You know, George Perkins Marsh, Man in Nature, back in the mid-1800s, Walter Loudermilk, and there are few to none of other efforts to save soils have been adequate. It's been that way for 10,000 years. We have had countless warnings from Plato, who lamented the demise of the mountains of Attica, to Patrick Henry, who said that the greatest patriot is the one who stops the most gullies. George Washington informed his overseer in 1795 that immediate profit was not so much an objective as the bringing of worn-out and gullied fields into condition to produce grass. In 1920, Aldo Leopold's job was to patrol the Prescott National Forest in Arizona. Here's what he wrote home to Mom. I am seriously thinking of specializing in erosion control. The problem is perfectly tremendous here in the Southwest, and I seem to be the only one who has any faith in the possibilities of tackling it successfully. In 1921, in an unpublished manuscript entitled Erosion and Property, Leopold wrote this: "The destruction of soil is the most fundamental kind of economic loss which the human race can suffer. With enough time and money, a neglected farm can be put back on its feet if the soil is still there. With enough patience and scientific knowledge, an overgrazed range can be restored if the soil is still there. By expensive replanting and with a generation or two of waiting, a ruined forest can again be made productive if the soil is still there. With infinitely expensive works, a ruined watershed may again fill our ditches or turn our mills if the soil is still there. But if the soil is gone, the loss is absolute and irrevocable." That was 1921. In 1923, Leopold prepared the Forest Service first manual on erosion control. But our national effort had to wait another 10 years, 1933, when Roosevelt took office and the Soil Erosion Service was formed, later to be called the Soil Conservation Service. And that was to address the private lands of farmers. Demonstration projects popped up. The most famous is the Coon Valley example in Wisconsin. This included the total watershed, capturing not only soil and water conservation, but the watershed's forests and all wildlife in the land and water. Leopold's 1935 essay on Coon Valley called for adherence to a comprehensive approach to a private-public problem. And then Hugh Hammond Bennett, the founding chief of the Soil and Water Conservation, or of Soil Conservation, was named by Roosevelt to head the new government. Bennett had been a soil scientist himself, and he had this to say in 1928. This is 5 years before Roosevelt's appointment. "What would be the feeling of this nation should a foreign nation suddenly enter the United States and destroy 90,000 acres of land, as erosion has been allowed to do in a single county?" Bennett insisted on putting the needs of the soil first. Any other approach, he insisted, no matter what it may be, always has and always must lead eventually to agricultural disaster. He recognized that it would not be easy. Quote, "There is no blanket, shortcut method for getting the conservation job done. There is no quick and easy way out." Bennett had walked the land and was able to tell his workers this: before any work is done, each farm or ranch is to be carefully analyzed, both as a piece of land and as a business enterprise. Now, as if this wasn't enough, he became even more inclusive. From every conceivable angle: economic, social, cultural, public health, national defense, conservation of natural resources is an objective of which all should agree. He also knew the temptations his workers might have. Quote, "We cannot depend on windshield surveys and office planning to carry out the job of the complexity and magnitude of safeguarding our farm ground and controlling floods." And later he says, "Complacency with respect to the security and sufficiency of our land is what we have most to fear." And he acknowledged the short term versus the long term. Another quote, there is likely to be soil improvement if the public's permanent interest. There is unlikely to be soil improvement if the public's permanent interest or if there are farmers who display deficiencies because of their temporary stewardship. Well, the Soil Conservation Service has been in existence for over 80 years, and U.S. soil still erodes at a non-renewable rate. So, why have we not solved this most urgent problem? Perhaps it's because we believe we can renew any degraded soil on Earth, not realizing that globally, I'm going to wait till that drone passes, not realizing that globally, soil is as much of a non-renewable resource as oil. Now, this is sometimes hard to understand, precisely because it requires thinking in geologic time, and most soil formation requires geologic, not human time. Now, here's where we got to roll up our sleeves and be prepared to go through rather systemically that it is much of a non-renewable resource as oil, because most people can feel or think in historical time, meaning decades, centuries, or now and then up to 4 or 5 millennia. The politician's time, of course, time frame is, of course, till the next election. But I'm going to spend some time, and some of you, probably a lot of you, have heard the one story I've told, because I've told it many times, but I have 2 geologic time stories associated with soil formation and decline. One of them is in California, and the other about 10 major river basins of the southeastern slope of our Appalachians. The California example first. Bear with me, I need to tell it again. In Mendocino County, California, north of San Francisco, 2 Berkeley scientists, Hans Jenny and Arnold Schultz, led Canadian ecologist Stan Rowe and me up and over what soil scientists call an ecological staircase. The treads of this staircase are due to the Pacific tectonic plate sliding under the continental plate, pushing it upward along the coast. What was once underwater became land, and waves nick away at the new landmass, and over time they leave an extensive terrace at each level. There are 5 such terraces for this oversimplified version of the story. But beginning at the ocean's edge, the first terrace was lifted up about 100,000 years ago. The second terrace, 200,000, the third, 300,000, the fourth, 400,000, and the fifth, 500,000. Terrace 1 at Ocean Edge features grassland, and on Terrace 2 are lush stands of redwood and Douglas fir. The third terrace is a transition zone with some bishop pine coming in. And the fourth and fifth terraces support what is called pygmy forest. And if one were to weigh up, say, 1 acre of all the growth on the redwood and fir that's on Terrace 2, there'd be a lot. Now weigh up a comparable area of Terrace 5 of the pygmy forests. Not much. And you can imagine the difference is obvious. Soil samples across the terraces show an abundance of land-based nutrients below the redwood and Doug fir, pushed up with plate movement, but much fewer essential to organism elements below the surface in the pygmy forest. Well, what has happened in the pygmy forest? Essential nutrients have leached downward and probably some off, in spite of the fact that both terraces have diverse perennial roots and cover. A natural ecosystem may greatly reduce the soil loss over time, but not prevent leaching or runoff discernible by the human eye except over geologic time scales. So, why are there no pygmy forests or pygmy prairies, whatever, all over the world? Well, our creative ecosphere keeps producing geological events like volcanoes, mountain formations, and glaciers. So teach us to number our days. Europe and North America have had uplifts in recent geologic times, the Coastal Range, the Sierra Nevada, the Rockies, and over the last 2 million years, the grinding ice of the Pleistocene glaciers giving us the topsoils and more of the upper Midwest. India has good soil because she's slipping into Central Asia. Australia has had no meaningful geologic event for 65 million years, and that is why Australia is agriculturally poor and sure to stay that way in human time frames. Soil is as much of a non-renewable resource as oil. Now for the second example, this one in the southeastern U.S. involving erosion rates from 10 river basins. This is not about leaching. The area was almost completely forested before European settlement, but a team of scientists set out to determine what the erosion rates were before Europeans arrived. And it was a scant 8/1000th of a meter per 1,000 years. 8/1000ths of a meter per 1,000 years. They call that the background rate of erosion. Not much. The rates of hill slope erosion and the yields of river sediment after settlement were studied. Peak cutting of the forest came in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and as the forest shrunk and agriculture expanded, hill slope erosion rate sped up. It is now about 950 millimeters, in other words, 950, almost a full meter, per 1,000 years. More than 100 times greater than background rates, and that's for the hill slope. Now the sediment load in the large basin during peak disturbance was about 5 to 10 times higher than pre-settlement norms. Lots of soil at the bottom of the various hills. And it came as a surprise to me that the rivers at settlement time were carrying only about 6% of the eroded material. So if there's any good news, it is that most of the historically eroded material does not go to the ocean, but stays at the base of hill slopes and along valley bottoms. But those areas at the base of a slope and the valley bottoms are small areas, and the soil there is deeper than it needs to be. The total area available for quality production was greatly reduced during settlement times. The total area available. Well, the Appalachians are old. That area has been exposed since the end of the Paleozoic. The midpoint of that era was about 500 million years ago. But like the Rockies and the California Coast Range and the Sierra Nevada, they wear down. Nature's ecosystems cannot totally protect them, but once, of course, we get annual agriculture, erosion went up 100-fold in the 10 Rivers region of the Southeast. Now, probably most of you are sitting there thinking, when's this going to get over? I've improved my garden or farm. What's Wes talking about here? Well, we can build and improve our gardens and our farms, but we do so because we all participate in acceptable thefts. Where does our compost and leaf litter for the garden come from? If the farm or field gets better every year, how much of the improvement is from non-renewable energy or materials from elsewhere? It's time to talk about soil origin, soil's real genesis. It's Sunday morning, we'll talk about Genesis. Think about a volcano like Mount St. Helens or Mount Vesuvius in Roman times. The ashes and hot lava left a destroyed landscape. Or imagine a glacier scraping rock and harvesting minerals from past geologic events. The glacier melts and leaves clay, boulders, gravel, sand, and what is called rock flour. So whether we're talking about the source of what soil scientists call parent materials, including such elements as sulfur, phosphorus, calcium, potassium, and more, recharge comes in geologic time. This is where the process begins, for to mold a soil, as Hans Jenny says, may last for centuries, millennia, even millions of years. And the various evolutionary stages are occupied by transient communities of plant and animals. Those building blocks of nature that I just mentioned, the phosphorus, calcium, potassium, all represented in the upper third of the periodic chart, those 20-some are all sterile. Acting alone, they cannot contribute to soil fertility. But with the right conditions, they will become essential parts and begin a journey through the biota, too free to know freedom, as Leopold would say. Soil genesis starts with sterile elements. This great mysterious ecosphere we belong to has many sources to help in the gestation. The winds will blow and the waters will flow within her. Her landscapes receive insects, seeds, microorganisms, invertebrates. In this still early part of the birth and growth stage of new soil, it'll be very slow to not at all if there's a lack of nitrogen. Now you say, wait a minute, lack of nitrogen. That element necessary to make protein molecules? The novice may ask, what do you mean, lack of nitrogen, when 71% of this atmosphere is nitrogen? Well, here's the problem. The atmospheric nitrogen that we all take in with every breath comes in small gas molecules. That entire 71% is useless for soil formation. Neither the animal world nor the green plants, acting alone, can utilize this nitrogen in bodily metabolism. It is one of the strongest bonds in nature. Nothing except the blue-green algae can use it. There are bacteria in the soil which can fix nitrogen, and because they can build their own bodies. Luckily, some die, and other soil microbes break the protein and convert some of the nitrogen to ammonia and nitrate. Now, and only now, is nitrogen available to green plants, which in turn produce sugars and starches as the energy source for the bacteria to break those nitrogen bonds. But you gotta have this interaction, and it almost sounds like a catch-22. So here is whammy number one. Plants cannot grow unless the substrate provides nitrates generated by microbes, yet microbes cannot deliver nitrates unless green plants furnish sugar and other carbohydrates. And now for whammy number two. Neither of these basic operations can proceed without the supply of magnesium, iron, phosphorus, molybdenum, and other sterile elements that are subject to what happened there in Mendocino County with the natural leaching. So think geologic time again. As soil scientists know in practice, the biotic inertia is slowly overcome by leaves and seeds and spores blown in, along with small amounts of ammonia and nitrates arriving in rainfall, and by the blue-green algae, which fixes both carbon and nitrogen. But without those elements supplied from below in geologic time, little happens. Well, it sounds dreadful. But thankfully, nature has given us a shortcut. A few of the nitrogen-fixing bacteria long ago learned to live in small nodules attached to roots of certain legumes, alfalfa, clover, soybeans. It's a symbiotic relationship. The bacteria get their sugars from the plant and deliver nitrogen back to the plant using some 21 enzymes at ambient temperatures to do the trick. Haber-Bosch, by the way, requires 350 atmospheres and 400 degrees C using natural gas as a feedstock. So, to draw a big breath here, at some point we recognize the soil as organism-like. Green expands, organic matter expands, roots descend, litter accumulates, small organisms appear, bacteria, molds, small animals seem to come out of nowhere, ants, spiders, springtails, sow-bugs, centipedes, worms. There is much digging of tunnels and creation of channels, creating pockets for gas exchange. As Hans Jenny put it, they arrange the soil framework to a livable abode. A soil ecosystem has been born. The knowledge of soils and their importance is sure to be broadened in this United Nations Year of Soil. And are we being asked to think of all soils, even those that are unproductive? Some gray, some black, some brown, some yellow, some white, some pink, some red. A few soil scientists I know tend to love them all. Love them enough to describe them, classify them, map them, interpret them. You don't want to get a good soil scientist started if you aren't interested. For the real soil scientist, soil is not dirt. For most of us, it'd be hard to love what Hans once described as expanses of barren, deep serpentine soils on the slopes of San Benito Mountains in California. Not a blade of grass is seen, not a weed, not a flower. Some soils are good, but shallow or erodible or too steep or too flat, having too much sand, clay, salt, or acidity, or suffering from subsoil cementation, that is hardening of the soil, poor internal drainage, or a high water table. Are we going to care about those soils? Well, if we're Unitarians, I guess so. I doubt that Methodists will. In the Midwest, we employ what we regard as the superior soils built by the grasslands from what was scraped off the Canadian Shield by Ice Age glaciers. The Kansas ice sheet caught the northeast corner of Kansas. There the soils are deep and black. Here and elsewhere in Kansas, we live off, and we're standing right now, sitting right now, on the powder blown in or washed in, mostly from Rocky Mountain uplifts and the glaciers that they hosted. That is why we have it good here in mid-continent, as far as soils are concerned. We're lucky because on a global basis, we are losing around 30 million acres a year due to land degradation. And from 1700 to 2000, the globe lost about 3 times the current U.S. ag acreage. So we have our work underway, but isn't it necessary for a comprehensive overview that is at once moral and intellectual? Hearing Angus yesterday, of course, we can all say yes. So some consider that soil erosion is due to a wrong-headed, overarching worldview we all have about the earth. Many philosophers, historians, theologians will argue that lack of concern comes from a deeper core of our sense of who we are. Much has been written by all three philosophers, historians, theologians about agricultural stewardship. And now in our time, Pope Francis, in his encyclical, mentioned soil several times. He referred to our sister, Mother Earth, who sustains us. He called on all Christians to act in ways that would preserve our options, to act on climate change, clean water, and so on. So I will have heard about the Pope and the wonderful encyclical. I've heard Prince Charles twice, and what he and the Pope have said runs far, far ahead of what a few politicians have suggested in aggregate. Many of us have been waiting for leaders to talk like this, and that the Pope took the name of Francis reminded me of a famous essay entitled "The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis," written by historian Lynn White back in 1967. There's some problems with that essay, but at the end, White concluded, "The greatest spiritual revolutionary in Western history, St. Francis, proposed what he thought was an alternative Christian view of nature and man's relation to it. He tried to substitute the idea of the equality of all creatures, including man, for the idea of man's limitless rule of creation. He failed. The profoundly religious but heretical sense of the primitive Franciscans for the spiritual autonomy of all parts of nature may point a direction. I propose Francis as a patron saint for ecologists. That's what Lynn White said back then in 67. Now we have dwelling among us a modern Francis Inflation Bud. Let's hope he also goes the distance and include the population front. Numerous unsung scholars have spent their lives to put humanity on a corrective course. A recent attempt comes from my friend Peter Brown, former speaker at Prairie Festival, and his colleague Jeremy Schmidt. Peter sent me a draft recently entitled Ethics for the Anthropocene. Mary Ellen mentioned that. They've taken up the challenge to get to the bottom of our problems, and they go back 2,000 years. They mention our Eurocentric conceptions, many of which have been rethought since Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species was published in 1859. The Darwinian evolutionists have not only undercut key assumptions about our origins, they have discovered countless examples of co-evolution, so much so that the co-evolution idea has become central in our modern thinking. Soil ecosystems are products of co-evolution of our ecosphere's biogeochemical systems. The early Earth's atmosphere, once free of nitrogen, began to thicken and organisms evolved with the change. The point is, co-evolution is everywhere as an idea being thrust more and more into the public square. Will that idea change our ways significantly? Probably not alone. There have been other conceptual changes in our journey which have not stopped soil degradation. We have known that we are no longer the center of anything, including our own galaxy, and we may not be God's chosen among all creatures, and we don't own the earth, and mind and body have become one, and women increasingly are regarded as equal to men and not men's property. So when will we have the will and the votes to save our soils? People with fine Eurocentric education like Darwin, Thoreau, and Leopold helped change many Eurocentric assumptions, and one of the most important being evolution. Does saving soil come under evolutionary thinking, and is evolutionary thinking enough? Brown and Schmidt say it's neither straightforward nor necessarily desirable to use evolution as the sole or even central basis for ethics in the Anthropocene. In fact, they warn us to avoid positioning any Eurocentric derived histories as central to Earth histories. They then make what seems like a major leap to me by saying that we would be reproducing colonial assumptions about the reference point for human stories being located in the West and its scientific practices of knowledge production. You got that? In other words, we've gained a lot, but don't count on it. Because of the being rooted in the West and its scientific practices of knowledge production. So, it's scientific practices of knowledge production that is on the line? Is that it? Is that the problem? How we gather and arrange facts? That may be worth thinking about. Are we really a fact-oriented people? And is that a problem? If we are, maybe that is what stands behind Sherlock Holmes' reminder in 1891. that there's nothing more deceptive than an obvious fact. Well, let's see where we are to this point. We have the FAO at work on soil. So we're going to count the Pope as all in. A few philosophers are at it. Many philosophers are engaged, more or less, in well-meaning half measures to get at the core of our destructive ways. My friends John Cobb and Bill Vitek are not in that category. My point is that we have to go back at least, not 2,000 years, but 10 to 12,000 years to the time when we made the break with nature's ecosystems and started, this won't surprise you, the annual grain production to the point where nature's integrities had to be greatly disturbed by the hoe and the plow if we were to eat. And to my mind, that is when dualism became a practice. 8,000 years before the Greeks or Romans or Hebrews talked about it, it was here that humanity began that awful task of dealing with thistles and thorns, and while at it, experiencing sweat of the brow. In other words, our condemnation is based on things we don't like. Moses' first book was trying to think of what it was that we don't like, and it was pretty easy to pick the thistles and thorns and sweat of the brow and say, that's your penalty. Now, Tim Cruz has recently asserted that since grain agriculture, the largest percentage of our awake time for farmers until the industrialization of agriculture has been devoted to weeding. And have we weeded? Sweat. Weeding nature has not been our friend, except we need to do it to eat. Weeds shade our crops and compete with them for nutrients. If we were meant to be weeders, we would have had longer arms. So those of you who know the land and its journey know where this is headed. I think that once again we have to fix our minds on where we stand in space and time, just as an ancient ancestors did. And so here's where I think we can begin to think about a structure. There, in the Genesis version, there is the tree of life and the tree of knowledge. We partook of the tree of knowledge and were driven from the garden, and the angel with the flaming sword denies access to the tree of life. We at the Land Institute have asked the angel to sheath the sword, and the angel has complied. We have no trouble with angels here at the Land. We can handle an angel. So here's what I think it could be a structure for us to begin to help us in this ecological journey. A framework, a coherent framework. So much of what I said is a warm-up to say that a more accurate framework about who and where we are is needed. So here's my try at developing that framework. And many of you know that one of my major gurus is the late ecologist from Saskatchewan, J. Stan Rowe. So let's start with Stan, who objected to the conflation of life and organism. And I'll read it slowly. It's a radical beginning. An alternative to the view that organisms possess life is that life possesses organisms. By this hypothesis, the secret of life is to be sought outwardly and ecologically rather than, or as well as, inwardly and physiologically. And let's drop the term biosphere, which carries with it the bio bias. And then we play fast and loose with atmosphere, and fast and loose with the soil crust, and fast and loose with water. Drop the term. Nothing wrong with biophilia, but the ecosphere is the creative source. That life possesses organisms is not common sense. But once we accept Sand's assertion, and this is St. Francis of Assisi's assertion, by the way, let's somebody get a hold of the Pope on this, that we live within a living earth that is beyond people and larger than what most of us refer to as life. Now our journey can begin. We can drop the vague term environment and instead embrace the non-vague term ecosphere. Ecosphere is not out there like environment. We are within it, and it can be more accurately defined. Much needs to be said about that. The ecosphere. It is older in time, larger in inclusiveness, that is, we're included within it, more complexly organized, superior in evolutionary creativity, and greater diversity. It's a product of evolutionary creativity. Stan Rose says that nothing is more important than comprehending the overarching supra, not super, supra organismic reality. By applying the term ecosphere as a given, ecology becomes central as we contemplate our place in the world, as we strive to replace the industrial mind with an ecological worldview. And that can only come by knowing our place in the world. Now, few of us have trouble being mindful that our star, our sun, provides radiant energy to our ecosphere. Less apparent is the reality that the heat from within the earth has been a major factor to make organismic life, including us, possible. Our planet would be dead without this internal fuel providing the geologic activity that has recharged the supply of organism-dependent nutrients, or those nutrients that come up, most of them long before our primate ancestors came into being. As we have seen from the Mendocino Terrace example and the Tin River systems, the soil's nutrients are pulled downward relentlessly toward the sea and downward through nutrient leaching, beyond the reach of plant roots. We have not been given a license to accelerate this loss of useful atoms at a rate faster than geologic recharge, but we've been doing it for 10,000 years, primarily with annual grain agriculture. But as the perennials come online and an ecological intensification effort broadens, we know that more will be needed. To pull this revolution off, we need an ecospheric worldview led by ecospheric studies to help create an ecological culture. We all applaud FAO's efforts, but I doubt we will come close to achieving FAO's notable goals without the cultural change that goes with it. I say that because this talk has been science-centric, and it'd be wrong to leave it that way. Bill Vitek and I and others believe that at the core of the modern mind is farming. and that a new mental model can emerge out of the work here, which is to say, out of nature as measure ideals, and that, of course, would feature ecology. Annual agriculture fueled the axial age, where most of our dominant world religions come from. All of the Greek and Roman philosophy in the modern age of Descartes, Galileo, Newton, and Smith have not stopped degradation of land on which this land animal, Homo sapiens, is dependent. Once food-producing land became farm and fossil fuels were discovered and used, it was probably inevitable the farm would become machine-oriented and land use would become the number 2 source of greenhouse gases. Let's hope that natural systems agriculture will help nourish an ecospheric worldview. So here's what every 8th grader should know. Know the significance of the difference between the soils of Switzerland and the United States. Know the lesson of Mendocino County staircase in the 10 rivers of our southeastern U.S. Know the history of attempts to stop abuse, soil abuse, and our failures. Know the genesis of soil, how it is that soil is as much of a non-renewable resource of oil, and why it's more important than oil, and what it will take to stop its erosion. And so, teach us all to number our days, not from 1492 or 1776 or Magna Carta or for the time of Jesus of Nazareth or when Caesar entered Gaul or from the time of Moses' Genesis or from the time when Cheops built his great pyramid, or Gilgamesh was sending woodcutters into the cedar forests of Lebanon. Teach all of that, but know this. The time necessary for soil genesis is the most appropriate standard of time for us if we are to properly apply our hearts unto wisdom.